so diving in, my name is Brandy Simonson, and I'm joined by my colleague and friend Kimberly Yannick. And together we're going to chat with you for the next hour around building habits of effective practice. And we'll give examples that are relevant across the range of learning contexts that we're seeing today across the country, whether you're in a remote mode or hybrid mode, or you have students in person. We'll try and provide examples across all of those. So please, if you have examples as we're talking, if you have questions, we'd invite you to put all of that in chat. When one of us isn't talking, the other one will be monitoring chat, so we will stay on top of that. And thanks to folks who are already starting to introduce themselves. Welcome, Fran. Okay, so we've structured today's talk around 4 guiding questions. So the first question is around understanding how we develop habits. And we're starting here because we feel like this is a really kind of easy way for us to think about how we then can create and build habits of effective practices in our classrooms, which is our second question. We'll then talk about, once we understand kind of how habits develop and how we can use that knowledge to support our own work within classrooms, how can we at the school, district, and state level really focus on scaling up those effective habits? And we'll land at the end with a couple of places where you can find resources to learn more, because there's no way to cover everything in an hour. So we'll point you in a few other directions, and we'll also share resources throughout. The PowerPoint and a handout note taker will be available online when we post the video to this. So you'll have access to all of those pieces in case you want to share this information back with colleagues. All right. So jumping in with how we develop habits, and you'll notice in the title I mentioned whether we mean to or not. So just think for a second about habits you have maybe in your own personal life. Some of them I think are probably supportive and healthy. Maybe some habits are things you want to create or develop. And maybe some habits you have are not the most healthy or the best habits, and you're looking to decrease or get rid of those. So kind of using your own personal examples, I'm going to walk us through kind of how we think about habit development. So for me, and for many of us, everything comes back to the basic building blocks of behavior, right? The antecedents, the behaviors, consequences. And recently there was a book published in 2014 talking about the power of habit. And I was peeking this morning, there have literally been centuries of study on habit development. And Charles Duhigg in this book really boiled down the basics of some of that science with really applied examples. And in his language, he talked about how we set up cues or antecedents, how we then respond or engage in the behaviors, and how then our environment provides rewards, or in our language, consequences for those behaviors. So some simple and maybe silly examples to kick us off that have nothing to do with classrooms, and then we're going to bring it into classrooms in a second. So for all of you with pets, especially those of you with dogs, you may have seen this behavior pattern happen once and maybe many times, that a delivery truck arrives and the dog goes crazy. They're barking, and not an actual consequence of their barking, but they experience that contingent on their barking, the delivery truck finally leaves. So the dog is all powerful, and after many opportunities to practice, they engage in this behavior, and they actually sometimes increase and have really fun and exciting or maybe obnoxious levels of this behavior across time. So they develop this habit of barking in response to the truck arriving. And again, their experience is that habit results in the truck then leaving. If we think about in 2020, we've developed new habits that when we're in public, we now know that we need to put on a mask. And the consequences for wearing a mask include things like avoiding germs, so we're able to stay safe and healthy. We're also showing respect to others, and so sometimes we get some of those positive praise statements either from ourselves or from our peers for engaging in that respectful behavior. So our environment cues the behavior, we practice the behavior, and then it works for us, right? We either escape negative things like germs, or we get access to positive things like attention. And again, many of us have had opportunities to practice different ways of mask wearing. These are our Yukon Huskies. And some of us get it wrong sometimes. And so usually we start to shape that behavior across time. We get praise when we do it correctly. We might get some corrections when we're not. And over time, we get really good at it, right? We wear masks, we stay physically distant, and that allows us, again, to be safe and to get that positive feedback from ourselves and from other people. So taking us into a grocery store, this might be in the before times, We may have experienced or watched other families experience what happens when they land in line and there is candy all along the edges of the line, right? So initially, you might get asked for a piece of candy. The parent might initially say no, and you all can play this out in your head, right? The whining starts. And potentially to avoid embarrassment or to avoid the negative attention from folks around them, the parent eventually just says, fine, I'm going to give in this one time. And those of us who have made that mistake know that that shapes some pretty exciting behavior from our kids, right? When we say no again, they know that if they dial it up to a certain level, they can eventually get us to give in. So if we think about what happens over time is the kid then develops this habit that has worked for them. And if we shift it, as I just did in the graphic, to thinking about now the parent's behavior, so the kid's tantrum or the kid's whining becomes our antecedent, we've learned to say yes. And the reason we've done that is because we can then get the tantrum to stop, right? It avoids that aversive situation for us. And so we can engage and develop these habits that just become how we start to engage in life, right? We approach a checkout line. We don't even wait for the tantrum. We just automatically grab the candy and we get to avoid that tantrum, and we might even get some positive attention from our child. So as we think about this, we might say this is maybe not the best situation, right? We don't want to leave it here. So this would be an example of a habit that we would want to change. And so if you think about putting yourself in that position, or for those of you who have been in that position, you realize that you can change key parts of this to create a better situation. So we can choose the checkout line that doesn't have those antecedents, right? We can choose the checkout line with no candy or no food. We can engage in a different behavior. We can engage the child in a game in line. We can engage in a positive conversation. And by doing that, not only do we avoid the tantrum, but we're congratulating ourselves on our awesome parenting. We're getting the positive attention from our child. We might even get some attention from people in line about what great parents we are. For some folks, they're posting on social media about how awesome they are. So we can really stack the decks to celebrate our successes, right? And I exaggerated a little bit. Probably we're not posting that on social media, although some people might. But we can change our environment to change the behavior. And so again, in these examples, we showed how that happens, whether we intend that to happen or not, right? The mail truck driver is not rewarding the dog on purpose, but the environment creates these contingencies that shape our behavior. So now that we understand a little bit about the ABCs, or how habits develop, we can think about how we take that into our choices and intentionally building effective habits in our classroom. So habits of effective practice. And so as we thought about for today's talk, we talked about a few key messages. So if we're going to focus on building habits of effective practice, we want to think about what are the simplest practices we can engage in that are going to have the biggest impact. So we're going to start simple. We're going to think about how to set ourselves up for success, how to build those effective habits, and how to then celebrate success. So in starting simple, we're going to think about the what. So what habits do we want to prioritize? And in your classroom, your school, your district, your state, there may be different sets of practices that are relevant, but we identified 3 key practices that we think are really important. And we're doing this again with the idea that we can make different choices to set ourselves up for success. So thinking about the smallest number of practices to have the biggest impact, the 3 that we identified, if we had a magic wand and could put these in every classroom, are to have teachers positively greet students at the door or at login. So welcoming them into the classroom, regardless of what the classroom context looks like. Teachers actively engaging students in learning. So getting high rates of opportunities for students to actively participate during instruction. And teachers providing specific feedback, both positive and corrective, but at least 5 to 10 positives for every corrective, specific feedback for students' learning and behavior. So those 3 practices we selected because they have a lot of evidence supporting them. They're culturally relevant. And in most contexts, those are also contextually relevant because you can implement those practices by tweaking them a little bit, as we'll talk about in a second, whether you're thinking kindergarten or high school, right? All of these practices work across ages, across developmental levels. And the other reason we thought about selecting these practices is because they help us do critical elements of effective practice that the Center on PBIS, in collaboration with other centers, have identified as critical. So thinking about how we can help connect, how we can help screen, how we can help support, how we can teach, and how we can monitor to create positive, predictable, and safe learning environments that help promote students' growth. And I'm just seeing in chat, it sounds like that participants are not seeing each other's chat. So I think Kim is going to see what we can do to maybe make sure you all can see each other, so you're connecting with each other. Fantastic. I was just making sure that wasn't something I needed to change. All right. So thinking then about those three key practices we mentioned, how they connect to all of these pieces. So let's start with the idea of positively greeting students as they come into the classroom or as they log into a virtual classroom. That positive greeting is your first chance to connect. So it allows you to establish relationships with your student. How they respond to your greeting is a quick screener, right? You know right off the bat how the student's day is going to look based on how they respond. If they don't respond, if they say something appropriate, engaging, or especially if they tell you something that's not super appropriate, that's your quick kind of cue for yourself about how to adjust your practice. That greeting is also a chance to provide the first prompt for them to engage in the expected behavior. So whether it's entering the classroom respectfully or responsibly turning in their materials, it's your chance to provide a quick prompt to set them up for success. And it's also a chance to then direct them to get engaged in the first academic opportunity, right? So it's your first opportunity to start teaching. And watching how they then follow those prompts or those reminders allows you to monitor how things are going and again, adjust your practice. So that one simple exchange as you're welcoming students into the classroom, again, connects to all of these different really important elements of effective practice that we've identified as especially important now. Second example is active engagement. So as you're actively engaging students in learning, that's again your chance to connect, to continue to build that positive relationship with students. How they're responding to your initial opportunities allows you to screen, to adjust your instruction early, to either give them a different way to respond or adjust the questions or opportunities. Active engagement is a really important practice for supporting student behavior, because if they're actively engaged in instruction, they're less likely to be engaging in disruptive behavior. It's also an incredibly evidence-based practice for teaching. So we know that active engagement and opportunities to respond lead to better, not just social, but also academic outcomes for students. And over time, students' responses are the way you monitor whether they're accessing that content and whether they're using the social, emotional, and behavioral skills in that content to be successful. So again, that one simple practice of actively engaging students touches all of these elements. And as the third and final example, thinking about giving specific feedback for positive social behaviors or desired social behaviors and also for academic responses is again a chance to build that positive relationship, assuming that your positives are outnumbering your correctives. How students respond is a quick screener. It's a key part of supporting students to provide that specific positive feedback contingent on social, emotional, and behavioral skills. And good, positive, and corrective feedback is a part of the instruction, right? Being able to set students up for success when they make errors allows them to learn, and celebrating successes keeps them learning. And if we're tracking how we give those positives and to whom we give them, it's also a way for us to monitor both our implementation, but also which students are engaging in desired social behaviors or correct academic behaviors, so we can then adjust our supports for them. So again, we chose those three simple practices because they allow us to do all of those pieces. That doesn't mean that you may not identify a different set of simple practices, but we're going to use those as examples for all of us to have some common things to think about. So now that we've identified the small number of practices that we really want to think about building as habits for our effective practice, we're going to think about how we can redesign or structure our environment to set ourselves up for success, to build those habits, and to celebrate our successes with them. So thinking about then how we do that, I want to take us back to the example where the parent remembered that there is a better way, right? That they have choices that they can make. And in the example, we talked about how the parent changed their environment so they could choose a different checkout line. They can engage in and practice a new behavior. They can have a line game or something they do. And they can celebrate their successes, whether it's self praise or whether it's getting attention from their child or even the silly social media post, right? They can change their antecedents, their behaviors, and their consequences to set themselves up, practice, and celebrate successes. So, if we then take that into classrooms and think about how we can do that for ourselves as teachers, we can do the same things, right? We can think about redesigning our environment, both to promote the practice we want to engage in, and also to make sure that we prevent ourselves from doing the things that compete with that. So, we'll give some examples in a second. We can also add prompts that help make it more likely that we engage in those practices. We can engage in those behaviors, those practices, and we can do them over and over until they become fluent, easy, automatic, right? We don't even have to think about it. It's just how we do our practice. And to make sure we're doing that, we can monitor our own implementation. On the consequence side, we can provide or recruit specific feedback. So we can praise ourselves when we get it right. We can kind of provide our own error corrections to adjust our practices. Even if we're not perfect, we can celebrate successes or steps toward implementation. So if we remembered parts of it, or if we were doing some of it, we can celebrate those successes. And we can make sure that those competing habits or competing things don't work for us. So we make sure we do not reinforce our own undesired behaviors. So let's take these basic ideas of how we can redesign our antecedents, behaviors, and consequences and think about how they apply to those three simple practices we talked about. So, starting with positive greetings at the door or at login. So, again, welcoming students, which is how we can connect, we can screen, we can support, teach, and monitor. So, to set ourselves up for positive greetings at the door, we can think about our environment. We might add a poster by our door to remind us the importance of greeting or welcoming students in. Or we could design our Google Slides or PowerPoint to have a welcoming slide prompt, right? So it gives us a cue that we should do this. I think one of the reasons sometimes we forget to do this is because we're still busy prepping for the class to start. And so in terms of preventing, we can make sure that preparation has happened in advance of class. And so we really are faithful to doing this practice of greeting kids. And because time gets away from all of us, having a reminder, whether it's an alarm on your phone or some kind of a prompt, sets you up to do this. And as a simple example of a prompt, there is a free app available for all operating systems called Be Positive. You can learn more about it at pbis.org with the specific hyperlink below. And that app, you can set up prompts for yourself. You can also track some of your practices. So we'll use this again as an example later. But it allows you to think about throughout the day when you want to make sure you engage in specific practices and pre-program prompts so your phone buzzes, vibrates, or just pops a reminder up depending on how you set it up. All right. So again, still thinking about positive greetings at the door, we can practice those greetings until they are easy. So if this is something that doesn't feel natural, teachers have, and you can see these all over YouTube, they have really fun different ways they welcome kids in and kind of engage them. We can also track or monitor whether we're doing it, right? We can see on a note whether we're greeting students, and Kim's going to share an example of that in a second. We can celebrate when we do it, so we can praise ourselves for doing a great greeting or welcoming students in. We might even get our class involved in the celebration. So if we start class efficiently, we might start with a quick celebration. And if we forget, instead of just moving on, we might take a minute to write ourselves a note or a reminder or set up the cue in our phone to make sure we're set up for success the next time. So those are kind of your simple strategies. And I'm going to tag Kim in to talk a little bit more about how we know if we're doing it, how we know if we're doing it in a way that's equitable, and how we make sure that we're differentiating our support to meet all students' needs.
Thanks, Brandy. So we look at the basic practice, and now, as Brandy said, I always, as a teacher, want to think about how I'm getting the most out of these practices, and at a leadership level, at a school, district, or state, how we're putting some structures in place to help us with that. So if we look at this example, you can see where we've taken the practice of greetings at the door, and there's we've been using this in different schools and districts that I work with, and they actually changed the prompts across the top. But what a great way to start tracking and use more intentionality around this evidence-based practice of greetings. So some teachers or some schools have added things like what was the last date of connection, because they're doing this at a school-wide level. And we take this application that allows us to collect data and progress monitor, make notes for ourselves, but they take this and make it like a live Google Doc, so that, across secondary schools, we have a track of this for ourselves. We're looking at preferences as we pivot between, in-person and remote learning. The other thing that we've done is, in terms of prompts, as Brandy said, is we've looked at our classroom teaching matrix, and we looked at the routines and procedures for arrival. And so what we've done is some adjusting that says, please log in 10 minutes early. And so then teachers then use the wait room in a Zoom platform, for example, and that way they can greet students just like they would do in a classroom. And of course, they've got the arrival routine posted or the bell routine posted for students to immediately engage in as they've already entered the room. So it's just a really nice way to collect data. This came about in one district because they weren't able to get their attendance and engagement data, and those rules have changed slightly during the remote context. And we weren't able to get the data in a timely way so that we could be more responsive faster. And look at those thresholds we've set for ourselves, our decision rules, to alert us that we might need to, check in on this. So this has been used lots of different ways. I love the way that schools are innovating with it, but I love how it wraps the data and the systems around the practice, and so that this becomes a school-wide effort. Some other resources that are available from the center that have been really helpful, just looking at, how do we do this? Positive greetings at the door. There's a nice, just here's how you do it. Here are some tips for those prompts, those systems features, or those cues features, if you will, for me to do it. I believe there's a fidelity check on this positive greetings at the door resource. And Steve Goodman, I noticed, is on the call, but yesterday I used a video from Michigan. They actually illustrate the practice, and it was so beautifully done. I wish I had thought to add it to this, but maybe he has more information he can put in the chat for us. It was a really nice resource to use for flipped learning, having teachers view that ahead of time, and then coming together to do this work, to collaborate together, like how would we do this together? And so the resource, the Socially Connected, helps us sustain this evidence-based practice as we pivot between the different teaching and learning contexts. And there's some great ideas there for, what could this look like? So I think we're going to look at the next active engagement practice.
Yes, thank you. Kim and I are going to tag back in and out throughout this webinar. And I love the example just because I think it's so simple but elegant, right? Thinking about how you can do all of those things with one chart that helps you differentiate, helps you track all of those pieces. So thinking about active engagement, these same elements are the ways we set ourselves up for success. So we're going to do a little bit more examples, and then I'm going to tag Kim back in to share some actual examples as well. So thinking about setting yourself up for success on the antecedent side, you're going to redesign your environment. And for some reason, my slides are not advancing. There we go. So we could actually go into our materials and add opportunities to respond, OTRs, into our lessons, right? A lot of the scripted curriculum or different teacher resources have some opportunities to engage students, but one way we can enhance active engagement is pre-planning ways to further those or increase those. We can also look into our lessons and our schedules and think about how we reduce the lecture-only segments and get active engagement happening. And again, we can add reminders or prompts for ourselves to make sure that we are spreading those opportunities around students and really thinking about how to set each student up for success with those opportunities. In terms of behavior, we can teach and practice engaging students or having those high rates of opportunities to respond until it becomes easy. So thinking about ways to get those up to a desired rate to make them more effective, to improve the quality, and again, to make sure they're spread across students. And to do that, we can track. And we mentioned the Be Positive app, and it'll come up again in a few slides. But it's a really quick way that you can just take a 5 or 10-minute sample of your instruction and count, right? You can also just use tallies on a Post-it note. It doesn't have to be fancy. And when we do a great job of delivering an effective or engaging lesson, we can praise ourselves for that. So we can recognize that, whether it's out loud or in our heads. We can also celebrate successes with students. So when they're actively engaged, maybe in an independent assignment, they can have music on while they're working. And we can make sure that when we're not doing that, it's not working for us, right? So if our rates are low, rather than just moving on, we have ourselves at the end of the day go back into the lesson for tomorrow and think about ways that we can set ourselves up for success for tomorrow. So we kind of hold ourselves accountable. We don't let ourselves off the hook. And I'm going to tag Kim in again to share some examples that address these questions.
Yeah, so this is one of those practices that I think is so critical right now. Everywhere I go, I'm hearing we're struggling with engagement, and how do we, set up our instruction, plan for our instruction intentionally to engage students. And so we just to illustrate the point, there are so many resources out there for active engagement, increasing OTRs, opportunities to respond, and just a quick search yielded all of these things. And the point is that they're there. And I think it's critical that we as leaders or as teachers, that we reach out to our colleagues. As leaders, we ensure that we have scheduling in place that allows collaboration to happen, so that teachers don't have to come up with this in isolation. And these are things that we can use in any context. And I love, this was one of the favorite resources I found, and I'll show you a picture on the next little click here of the spider web discussion map. I've seen this used in secondary classrooms, and I can see it being used in elementary classrooms, but it was a lovely way, again, to wrap data around this practice. And one example was that, there's some independent learning, flipped learning going on, maybe some pre-teaching with students who need a little bit more direction, but some prompts about the content before students join together. And then when students come together, they're really leading the discussion, and the teacher's role is to collect data on the discussion, to map that discussion, and then share that map with students, the data, so that they can process and reflect and identify, wow, we did a really good job of taking turns talking. We did a nice job of listening to understand. Perhaps we did a good job of using those critical skills, of building on one another's ideas and thoughts. It's a great way, I can't help but add, to infuse the social emotional learning within the academic instruction. So just the point of this, just sharing these examples, there are things that we've done in in-person teaching and learning that can easily be applied to remote instruction. And one other example, just really quick, is Anita Archer, who I watch over and over again. And again, I got to give kudos to Michigan, because there are a few videos, if you want to list a boost in your day or to revisit explicit instruction and opportunities to respond. For me, she is my go-to. And when I observed and reviewed one of her recordings from Michigan recently, she used the old-fashioned, I call it old-fashioned, but the response card. Think about our whiteboards, our dry erase boards. And she used this, and I thought, well, gosh, we can do that. We can do that in a remote example as well. But what it allows is for teachers, again, to collect data on those opportunities to respond and how students' understanding is showing up. So just some quick things to prompt us. I think looking at some resources that are available were really helpful. And just a reminder that creating space for teachers to collaborate, and the big prompt is the lesson plan development, working together to say, how are we going to take this? Maybe we've only used lecture format, And how might we replace that, or one hand at a time, or one chat response at a time, with an opportunity that invites and allows more engagement. And I absolutely love the resource here from our center, where we're looking at engaging instruction and a few other practices as well, including performance feedback, to increase equity in education. And OTR's engagement is one of those, hallmarks of the pedagogy of culturally responsive teaching. And this does a really good job of explaining, giving examples for us, like how we might lean into this. And of course, Anita Archer, just make your popcorn and settle in, because she is just the best, I think, with opportunities to respond and engagement.
Thank you. I love both of those resources and the comments that you made about teachers needing space to collaborate, whether it's in person, but also in virtual. And I think building in those spaces needs to be really intentional, because things don't happen accidentally in the way they did when we were kind of in person and live. So thinking about then the third critical practice we mentioned of providing specific feedback. And again, that feedback might be positive, it might be corrective, but really thinking about that ratio, so we ensure positive outnumbers corrective by at least 5-1. We can think about how we set ourselves up for success. So how do we redesign the environment? One of the things I struggle with specific praise is thinking it through on the spot when there's 37 other things in my head going on at the same time. And so one of the activities we've done with teachers is have them kind of pre-plan or script praise. So that's not to say that they have to read it in the moment, but it just has them think through different praise statements that match their context, that match their culture and the way that they teach, and also to think about matching their students. So they're delivering praise in a way that's actually going to reinforce students, whether that's public, loud, animated, private, writing, whatever. So thinking about planning that ahead of time allows us to be more successful in the moment. And I think the other piece is sometimes the thing that competes with praise is lots of error corrections. And so as an educator and as a parent, I think sometimes we have to be intentional in looking for desired behaviors, because the less desired, especially disruptive behaviors, pop up and call our attention to them. So we have to be looking for the desired behaviors for praise to happen, right? I think sometimes reminders, even for this, are also helpful. So the student behavior should be our reminder to praise. But if we want to set our phone up to just make sure that once every few minutes we've at least provided one praise statement, that little buzz in our pocket or the thing that pops up on our screen can help provide a reminder of that. Again, for this to happen, it has to become fluent for us. It has to be automatic. If this is one of the 37 things in your head, it's unlikely to happen. So it has to just come out of your mouth without a lot of thought. And to be able to do that, we not only have to practice, but we have to actually look at our own data. And the Be Positive app will come up again as an example for that, because you can, not all day, but for 10 minutes, take a second and just be tracking positives to correctives so you can see where you're at with your ratio. And it also then provides kind of a reminder of the importance of that specific feedback. When you do hit your desired ratio or your goal, you can tell yourself way to go. You can give specific praise. In some of our research, we've had teachers set goals and actually plan a reinforcer for themselves, whether it's a special beverage or a special treat or a privilege like getting to read a book for 15 minutes uninterrupted, whatever it was for them. They can also celebrate their environment, celebrate praise with their environment, and model and have students practice it with each other. So it creates a really positive classroom culture. So they're modeling it, but they're also having students practice it. And we can make sure that if we are kind of slipping into the habit of more error corrections than praise, instead of just letting it slide, we go back and we rethink about our antecedent strategies. We write out new praise statements. We think about the prompts. So we hold ourselves accountable to make sure we're focused on the praise. And again, I'm going to pass it over to Kim to talk a little bit more about how we know we're implementing it, how we're sure it's equitable, and how we differentiate.
Yeah, thanks, Brandy, for setting that up for us. And again, the data is so critical. Brandy gave us an example of just collecting data on ourselves, which quite frankly is a little easier to do now because most of us are recording things. And this is one of those practices that I think it's really important. We've done a lot of work with the equitable use of this practice, and having that data that Brandy was talking to is critical to create awareness and to move us into different habits, if you will, to set up the cues and prompts to do things differently. There's a whole continuum of resources here, the old-fashioned counter, tally marks on a sheet of paper or a sticky note. The Be Positive app is so cool because it gives you data. It'll not only remind you and prompt you, but then it'll give you data that you can review. And some other examples, we worked with some schools where they were looking at their student outcome data, and they were noticing a disproportionate number of males were being, teachers were observing and reporting behavior. And so they didn't tell teachers that, but they started focusing on just this practice. And they said, we're going to give you each a roster, and we'd like for you to take, like Brandy said, 10 minutes during this period, because when they looked at their data, this was a time when they were seeing an increase in disruptive behavior with males. And so they asked teachers to chart their data. And they did that, and they asked teachers to engage with that data. And what did you notice? And just by collecting data and then having that time and space that Brandy mentioned to reflect and engage with that, they noticed that they weren't using the 5-to-1 very well with males, with the gender differences. And so then the team said, okay, let's look at that data compared to our outcome data. And just by using the data around this one practice, not making any assumptions, providing professional learning for all on what it is, teaching how to collect data on self, or if you have a trusted colleague that you say, could you come for 10 minutes, like Brandy said, and collect data, but then using the data to help us build those cues and prompts that are, that awareness even is a bit of a cue, if you will. And then together celebrating, they started, getting the average school-wide for the 5-to-1. And they had a group contingency, if you will, for staff that said, look at how our ratio is changing on average across the school. And that's that response that started reinforcing. It was a beautiful thing to watch and observe as these schools did this work. So I really encourage you to always think about how you're wrapping the data and the systems around these practices. And there are a few examples from the center, again, that are just really helpful. The student teacher game is a great one. It's some of you may have heard it called the good behavior game, but Susan Barrett and I worked in a grant where we found this to be really helpful for us as the adults to boost our habits. We got feedback from the students because they loved it. They had so much fun with it. And it just helped us structure that environment to increase our dosage or our usage of those practices. And this practice on the right, I just discovered this recently, and I'd have to tell you, I'm crushing, because it has all of these practices in it. And it's just a nice prompt cue, if you will, to plan for how I might do these. What will my response be? What will I do? Things in place. And then use this, like Brandy said, I could put in there little stems or starter statements for my practice of behavior specific feedback. So again, two great resources that cover more than just corrective feedback. You're getting a lot out of your money on those two resources.
So thanks to Kim for sharing, I think, some fantastic examples. And I keep reflecting on the content in this presentation as I work with districts, especially folks who are struggling or individual teachers right now who feel stuck. To me, I think these really simple practices are a really effective way to start, right? We can start building habits of effective practice. And as Kim shared with us in the examples, we can then think about how we differentiate, how we adjust, how we use data to guide those kind of decisions we're going to make about the practice. But it allows us to get started with something that's simple, doable, but also likely to work because it's evidence-based and has data supporting that it's culturally relevant for many students. And we talked specifically about how we get started, right? We redesign our environment. We think about setting ourselves up for success. We practice these habits of effective classroom practices to the point that they're fluent, they're automatic. And then we use simple data. And the example Kim just used was brilliant because it was so easy, whether it's an app that tracks it for you or a simple roster, it gives you that feedback to know where you should adjust and enhance your implementation. And when we get it right, or when we're close to getting it right, we can celebrate progress toward and then eventually successful implementation. And how great is it for us as adults, especially in a really stressful context, to be able to celebrate and acknowledge those successes, right? That helps promote our own wellness and well-being, in addition to effective practices that are going to work for our students. So we're going to now think a little bit more that we kind of know about developing effective habits. And we've used a lot of examples that if I were an individual teacher in any building, I could do, right? I can help myself set these things up for ourselves or for myself. But ideally, as many of you on this webinar, we're working in schools, districts, and states that are investing in scaling up effective practice. So how do we set up the context to enable educators to be successful, to celebrate and set students up for success? And how do we think about scaling that? And so I'm going to pass over to Kim to get us started and give a great example of this.
Yeah, and I can't help but think of scaling up all the time. So I'm so appreciative, Brandy, that you keep reminding us, start with a simple basic practice. And then, our beloved circles, which George Sugai was recently speaking, and he said something, and I just about jumped out of my seat. He goes, I just see the world in triangles and circles or something like that. I'm like, oh my gosh, I have that. I do that too. And so when I think about the circles, just to think about wherever you are in the organization or the education system, everything we do is grounded in equity. And we have these shared outcomes that we're all working towards. And thinking about how you're using the data, no matter what scale or the point of analysis we're looking at, whether it's a classroom, a school, a district, what have you, to uncover that current reality. Where are we in terms of meeting those outcomes? And this might be on staff behavior, like where are we in terms of our 5-to-1 ratio as a collective organization? What are the practices? And Brandy, she's brilliant because she's like, when we were planning this, these 3 practices really get so much. And she's right. If we just focused on 3 simple practices and building fluency and using data to guide that fluency building, we'd be in a good space. And this systems piece is what we really want to talk to, taking those cues and prompts and the responses or rewards, reinforcement, if you will, the things that help shape and sustain behavior at using a systems approach for the adults is really, bringing our circles back to the work that we do. And so I think I'm going to pass this to you, and then you're going to pass it back to me. It's like a really quick pass here.
I think so. So I think as we're talking about scaling, and as Kim said, this is now our kind of systems view, right? So we're stepping back from thinking about individuals within classrooms and thinking about schools, districts, and states. It's the idea of doing these same exact things to set everyone in that organization up for success. So how do we not just on an individual level redesign the environment, but how do we think systematically about redesigning the environment for all of us? How do we add prompts in a systematic way? How do we make sure everyone in the organization is teaching and practicing these effective habits and monitoring them? And how do we create a culture in our organization, again, whether we're thinking school, district, or state, that celebrates success and that make sure things that are competing with those effective habits don't work for us? So how do we prevent the rewards for those undesired behaviors or kind of quote unquote bad habits? And Kim has a really fantastic example that I know I can relate to, and I think many of us can relate to, about what this looks like in the current context. And Kim, I think you're going to have to prompt me when to show each picture for this slide.
Do a little signal. Okay. So Susan, I mentioned Susan Barrett, and I'm not sure, I think she might be on the call, but we talk a lot. And when this whole, the pandemic started, we were talking, and somehow we landed on Trader Joe's, and I'm like, oh my gosh, they're using PBIS. It's so cool. They're using habits, about how to shape our behavior. And so she lives in California, I live in Virginia Beach, and we both have just been amazed how they continue to respond to the restriction changes and so forth, using these basic habits to shape the customer behavior, and I would argue the workforce behavior. And so one of the things, if you haven't shopped at Trader Joe's or you don't have one near you, my apologies. But one of the things we value as Trader Joe's patrons is that we bring our own bags. And when we had to pivot to different behaviors, as Brandy started us out with in this new context, we couldn't bring our bags any longer. So that was a change in an expectation or a routine, if you will. So they defined it and they posted it for us. And then they posted some other new things that we had to consider. And sanitizing, someone stands at the door and they squirt you, and you do this little bit before you walk in. And then if you look at the next example, and then just keeps coming into us. They had prompts in place. So that social distancing, remember the Yukon, what are they, Huskies? The mask wearing, they said, please, keep your physical distancing. And then they put these prompts in place to cue us as the adults while we were building this new behavior, this new habit, if you will. And they did it inside the store. They have big plexiglass up there. And I have to say that the first couple times I went in, I didn't see the sign that was as big as day in front of my face asking me to stay behind the plexiglass. So I got a little error correction a couple times, but they didn't shame me. They didn't kick me out of the store. It was very respectful, a little prompt reminder. And then you'll see some other things they did that, while you're waiting in line, now they've got the prompt of 6 feet physical distancing, and they're adding these words of encouragement. You can do this, you're strong. And I'm looking down, smiling. I'm like, okay, yes, I can do this, right? And they added some other things, like right when I got up to the checkout, there's that behavior specific praise. Thank you. And here's the behavior for practicing social distancing, right? So it was just embedded throughout the system, these prompts and these reinforcements, if you will. And you can see that here, that's bring your own bag, and just in case you don't go to Trader Joe's, but they've recently, in Virginia at least, changed the restrictions, and now we can bring our own bags. So they've now got our prompts, please bring your own bag, we'll bag it still, but you can bring your own bag. And if you do, you get a little thing that says, thank you for bringing your bag, and you put it in that box, and they do drawings. And they use data. So they actually have data now that they've pivoted to using the same foundational blocks for building habits around the reinforcement, but it was hidden behind the boxes of wine, so I couldn't get a good picture. But then I saw this data that's right up in front of us as we're checking out. And notice what they're doing. There's some shared values that they're maybe assuming, or they, work with their customer base about giving. And so they posted data like, look at our collective effort. Because you shop here and you share these values with us, we're going to show you the data to celebrate, what we're contributing to. So I think Susan and I have just fell in love with Trader Joe's all over again, because they are doing what we're doing in schools. So you did a great job navigating all of those.
Thank you for that specific praise. So that I just totally resonated, or that example resonated with me, because I think that when we think about these practices and the ways that we scale practices, we can sometimes make things really complex. And I think the grocery store examples, whether it's Trader Joe's or another one that you go to locally, are so fantastic, because we've all had to adjust our behaviors at a kind of society-wide level in very major ways. And so when we think about how we were set up for success in these new contexts, we can then bring that into what we do within our schools, within our districts, within our states, to set educators and students up for success. So focusing on those systems pieces, keeping Trader Joe's examples in the back of our mind, we're going to think about in the ABC sequence. So on the antecedent side, one of the things that we encourage districts and states especially is to think about the resources that schools and educators need to be able to be successful. And all of you who work at the district and state are recognizing the kind of irony in not being able to actually provide more when your budgets are being cut, or when it's not actually possible to add sand to the hourglass. We can't give people always more time. But one of the things I think we can do that allows folks to feel that they have adequate resources to support their practice is really help educators prioritize what are the critical things that they need to be doing and doing well to support students. And again, that's where we landed on those 3 critical practices. Not to say we're not doing more, but if we really want educators to focus on a small number of things they can do well, we need to, in our context, help identify what those are, prioritize those, and celebrate those. So thinking again about how to arrange resources to set educators up for success with what they're being asked to do. And then how do we help with training and coaching to build that fluency? So while we gave examples of educators being able to do it for themselves, it's much more ideal if we're providing support, again, in brief trainings, whether they're live or virtual, in ongoing coaching. And I think in some of the places that I've worked with, I've seen some of this pause in the current context. And I might argue that if we are doing this in a supportive environment, so this is not evaluative, it's not judgmental, but if we're doing training and coaching in a supportive environment, we probably need it more than ever, right? We're all having to change our practice. We're all having to do new things. We all are concerned about kind of different aspects of student behavior or student need. And so we should be wrapping supports around our teachers rather than thinking about them not being able to handle more. And again, I think we can only do that if it's supportive training and coaching, but thinking about how we do small dose supportive coaching throughout this context. And how can we, as administrators, trainers, coaches, leadership team members, how can we help set up the environment to prompt and remind the behaviors we'd like to see? If we're still in school, how do we maybe use morning announcements as a reminder for creating that positive classroom culture? How do we use posters in the building? Maybe if we're virtual, we share a common slide or a common backgrounds that we ask teachers to use that have some of these expectations and a reminder for welcome to class, right? So a reminder for greeting. How do we set the environment up to, again, to prompt or remind these behaviors for all of our educators? And as we mentioned, how do we use data to drive our decision making? And I think we can make data complex, but Kim also gave some really nice examples, whether we're thinking classroom or scaling up, of how we can look at data to monitor not just outcomes, but the fidelity or the kind of faithfulness of our implementation. So how do we make sure folks are greeting their students? How do we make sure there is active engagement or there is that opportunity for specific feedback? And so the app like Be Positive is something as a coach you can peek at if teachers are willing to share their data. We can also look at other existing data. And if we're coaching, that's a chance for us to, again, take supportive data to support practice, not to evaluate, but to support practice. And part of support is providing that performance feedback. So, hey, I loved how you engaged your students when you did this. Maybe this is something you could also think about during this routine where it seemed harder to get folks engaged. So again, providing data-based feedback that's supportive, that encourages good practice, but is welcomed because it actually results in better outcomes for teachers. And even if you can't do all of those pieces, taking time to celebrate successes, right? Building a culture that not just for kids, but for the educators and all of the adults in the building and the, again, district and state, thinks about where do we recognize and celebrate progress towards successful implementation or hitting the goals we've set for our implementation. So how do we really think about prioritizing celebration and specific celebrations for our successes? And Kim, I'm going to tag you in to give a little bit of a kind of preview or an exciting thing about the webinar coming up in January.
Yeah, just that, think what Brandy just offered, I think is critical right now. And that's building that culture of appreciation and acknowledgement for everyone in the school community, our families. Everyone is having to be flexible and have a little more grace these days. And so as you're thinking about this system, I invite you to think about how you're wrapping your system in wellness. There are simple ways to start normalizing wellness as part of our way of being with one another, part of our way of work, if you want to say. But we're, Susan Barrett and I will be taking a deeper dive with that on January 19th with the next webinar. So stay tuned.
All right, thank you. So we're going to talk through some resources as we kind of, just kidding, we're going to talk through a little bit of the bigger picture before we talk through some resources.
And I'm going to talk just briefly as a reminder, because I think the resources are critical. Just reminding you, if you're at the district and state level, come back to your implementation blueprint and think about, put your habits lens, if you will, like what systems need to be in place to make all the things that Brandy's talking to us about scalable. How do we look at our funding and especially alignment right now? How are we looking at that training and coaching? What's possible right now? So just a reminder to come back and look at this and look for ways to adjust things to reflect and build these habits that Brandy's talking about on a large scale.
That's fantastic. Thank you. So thinking then about how we have scaled habits, we're going to take a couple minutes just to look through some resources, but I'd like to invite you to use chat to ask any questions or share examples or resources that you all have, because we can tweak our last few minutes to be able to pause and answer questions, or we can kind of keep going through some of the resources and review. So you'll help us choose the adventure that we're all on. So again, thinking about scaling up habits by building into the system those opportunities to cue and provide practice and celebrate enhancements. So in terms of resources, there are two key places I'd like to highlight because there is so much out there right now that I feel like at least I get overwhelmed. So one of them is the Center on PBIS has pulled together resources to really focus on implementation at the classroom level. So you can find these by hunting around the website, but if you click on the show more or less button and you scroll down to the bottom, there are lists of resources, and the three that I think are the most helpful are focused on practices, systems, and data, right? Those circles that Kim showed you. So the supporting, and this is advancing on me without me clicking. The Supporting and Responding to Student Behavior Guide is one that really breaks down and provides examples and non-examples and links to other resources around key practices in the classrooms. So it goes beyond the three practices we highlighted, but it provides a context in which those practices can be maximally effective. The systems brief unpacks some of the content we talked about in terms of how do you think about training, coaching, monitoring, and celebrating. So those are embedded into that systems brief. And the data guide talks about how do we use data to power both of those. So how do we in a classroom look at data to support our fidelity and outcomes of classroom practices? And at a systems level, how do we think about the fidelity and outcomes of our training and coaching? So those three resources kind of fill those bubbles or fill those circles with a lot of rich information beyond what we covered during this hour. The other place I wanted to direct you to is there's a topic page on supporting schools during and after crisis. And so this highlights the guide that I mentioned earlier. And if you scroll down a little bit, it talks about kind of the critical features, which Kim mentioned, and then it gives examples at the state and district level, at the school and classroom level, and at the family and student level. And this is a version of it that gets everything on one page. But if you actually scroll down, there are examples, action planning templates, videos. There are a ton of resources baked into this page. So between the classroom topic page and this one, you'll have a lot of access to examples, resources that are relevant across different learning and classroom contexts. So with that, I'm going to take us through just a little bit of a review and wrap up. And Kim, feel free to pause me if questions pop up that I'm not seeing. All right. So kind of dialing back to where we started, we talked about how we develop effective habits. So we talked about, first of all, how we develop habits, whether we mean to or not. And we talked a lot about antecedents, behaviors, and consequences, and how those set us up for different habits developing. Again, whether we are a dog conditioned by a mail truck, a parent conditioned by kids' tantrum behaviors, or whether we're a parent who's actually changing our environment to set up the parenting behaviors we want to engage in. And we use that example to help us then think about how we can build effective habits in our classrooms. So we talked about starting simple with a few key practices. For us, we highlighted greeting students positively as they enter the classroom. We talked about actively engaging students during instruction and providing specific feedback, both positive and corrective, but making sure positive outnumbers corrective. And then we talked about how as individual educators, we can set ourselves up for success. We can practice and monitor our practices to make sure we're building those effective habits. And we can celebrate ourselves when we meet our own implementation goals. And we can bring our students into those celebrations as well. More importantly, for folks here at the school district and state level, we talked about how we don't leave teachers to figure it out on their own. So while we can do this for ourselves, it's more important and more effective when we can set teachers up for success by scaling the system to build effective habits. So thinking about how at a systems level, we're building in prompts and cues, how we're making sure we're allocating resources or helping teachers prioritize what they need to do with the existing resources. We're providing opportunities to train and coach in a supportive way and also monitor in a supportive way. We're providing performance feedback to help ourselves enhance and adjust our practice. And we're celebrating those successes with each other. So, again, building a culture of celebration that helps to promote wellness. And Kim did a nice job of previewing the webinar coming in January that really talks about prioritizing wellness for students and staff. And we highlighted 2 pages that are kind of your two-stop shops for getting a lot of the resources, both the classroom topic and the return to school page, which are both linked from pbis.org. So we would just like to thank you very much for spending the last hour with us. I have loved presenting with Kim. It's always an honor to get to share space with her. And we look forward to learning with all of you in future opportunities. So stay safe, stay healthy, and we will